Initiative. The Climate Change Initiative. Mark Wenzler's here, and we appreciate all of his help in working to make this a successful event. Today's speaker is Dr. Kevin Teichman. He has a BS and MS degrees from Massachusetts Institute of Technology and a PhD from the University of California at Berkeley, all in mechanical engineering. He lives in Rockville, Maryland, where he and his wife, Marcia, are proud empty nesters and grandparents. And they've been to Chautauqua several times, but couldn't make it this year. So we're Zooming him in, as well as some of our audience. But we welcome both the Zoomies and the Zoomettes, or whatever the right word is for people coming in, however you got here. Now, Dr. Teichman recently retired from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, where he served for 33 years in multiple positions, including the Deputy Assistant Administrator for Science in the Office of Research and Development, the highest career position, that is non-political position, in EPA's research office of 1,500 employees. Upon his retirement, he received the prestigious EPA Distinguished Career Service Award. In his position, he led the planning of the ORD's research program that was about $500 million annually. But in retirement in the past 6 years, Dr. Teichman has been an adjunct professor and senior research fellow at Georgetown University in the Environmental Meteorology and Policy Program, a unique multi-agency graduate level program he helped to establish. This includes teaching a 2-semester course on advanced environmental sciences and policymaking. Please give a Chautauqua welcome to Dr. Kevin Teichman, and we'll now let magic happen and let him zoom in.
Thank you very much, Bob, for that very kind introduction, even if I wrote it myself. But my mother and wife would be glad to hear it, I believe. I hate to start off a presentation, excuse me, with an apology, but I wish I were there with you. My son and my daughter-in-law are here between assignments. He's a foreign service officer, and I wanted to be here for the few weeks that we could spend time with them. So I appreciate being able to present this by Zoom. Also, I have a tendency to use wordy slides. I promise not to read my slides, but my students, and perhaps you, I will make my presentation available, want to refer to it later. It makes it a lot easier to understand when you see complete sentences instead of just individual bullet points. I always use a disclaimer just to make sure it's clear these are my opinions and not necessarily those of the organizations I am or have worked for, and any trade names I use not intended to imply that they are the best or only products to accomplish a given task. Now to the subject at hand. Let me first of all start by saying global warming and climate change are not interchangeable, even though people use them so. Global warming is what is the change, if you will, in our environment due to human activities, primarily fossil fuel burning, for example. And climate change is what is caused by both human and naturally produced warming. So in a sense, you can say global warming is a subset of climate change. On the right side of this slide, you can see what you all know, that 2023 was the hottest year on record. The bad news I would follow up with that is it's probably the coldest year that you will experience during the rest of your lifetime. Climate change is happening, and it's having an impact on people. I'm showing here climate justice refugees, either from excessive rainfall and floods or desertification. And we believe at least, and it will probably increase, 20 million people a year have to leave their homes and move to other areas. So let's go right into what is happening in the United States. We'll then go into the global perspective, and then what can be done on a local level. This is the energy or CO2 emissions, I should say, associated with energy for the different sectors that we have. First of all, you can see there's a total change in 2019 that it went down 2.6%. And so CO2 emissions in the United States went down. That's primarily due to the transfer from coal-fired power plants to gas-fired power plants, meaning it's still the burning of fossil fuels and still creates CO2, just not as much. Also, you'll notice here that recently the transportation sector has emitted more CO2 than the electric power industry. And not to be forgotten, industrial sources are important. We'll talk about that, as well as in your own home and other buildings where things are pretty much staying constant. So within the United States, this gives us some opportunities of what we might try and accomplish. First of all, an overhaul of the transportation sector. If it's the largest sector emitting CO2, perhaps more public transportation, electric vehicles, higher efficiency fuel vehicles is the direction we might take. And energy efficiency and clean energy standard that would require our utilities and grid operators to improve their energy efficiency and improve that, achieving an 80% reduction by 2030. A lot of talk about environmental justice and next generation industries being built in those disadvantaged communities to try and improve their life, as well as prepare the next generation industries to serve our country. Carbon capture demonstration, we'll talk about that. Plugging oil and gas wells, particularly because they emit methane, which is an even more potent greenhouse gas, I believe you probably know, than carbon dioxide. Energy efficient housing, demonstrating things in federal buildings as the first place to, if you wish, the private sector and public sector to take on clean power, you have to demonstrate it can be done, and the federal building stock is the first place perhaps to do it. And then demonstration projects so that we can look at energy storage, the role of hydrogen, advanced nuclear, offshore wind, electric vehicles, and even quantum computing to improve our computer systems. So what's happened in our country during this administration? There was a Senate climate bill. It was signed, you can see in the last bullet, by the president in August of 2022, but here's the description of what's in that bill, and I'm showing it from Senator Schumer's perspective, and then we'll see Senator Manchin's perspective after that. The Inflation Reduction Act, which doesn't sound like it's doing very much to improve the environment, actually has a lot of dollars being devoted to environmental things. 60 billion for clean energy manufacturing and 30 billion for tax credits and solar panels. You can read as well the other ways that dollars in that bill are being spent on environmentally sound practices. And I would add to this that actually the dollars are going equally to red and blue states. So you may have heard President Biden in the State of the Union say, would you Republicans like to give back the money that have gone to your states as part of the Inflation Reduction Act? And the money for this would come through an increase in the corporate tax rate, 15%, and prescription drug reform. So that's Chuck Schumer's perspective. But this is a compromise. It's our government working to create a bill that most people can live with. So Joe Manchin's view is that it holds the administration's feet to the fire to ensure they continue substantial oil and gas leasing. In other words, the federal government has to put forward leasing for 2 million acres of public land and 60 million acres of offshore areas for oil and gas annually for the next decade. So this doesn't show that fossil fuels are going away. This makes it clear that while we are boosting renewable sources of energy, we also need to be concerned that fossil fuel will still be developed and burned. And of course, you've heard a lot about the Project 2025, that this is how former President Trump would, if he were to win the election, he would go, and you can see in the third bullet, block the expansion of electric grid for wind and solar energy, slash funding for the EPA, shutter DOE's renewable energy offices, prevent states from adopting California's car pollution standards. So as the upcoming election, there is a clear choice, I believe. You can decide which, of course, who you wish to vote for, but their views on the environment and how to proceed are dramatically different. Now let's look at things from the global perspective, no longer just the United States. This is a very complicated figure that I do want to walk you through it as best I can. As you can see, there is a sector, if you will, attributed to each country. The United States is in blue, and it's got 14.4 as the number. That's the CO2 emissions per capita. So per person in the United States, we are among the very worst of these CO2 emitters across the world. China, as you can see, is about half on a per capita basis of what we are. But if you put factoring in their population, they emit more. So the amount of orange you see in their sector, overall, the area is larger than that in the US blue sector. I also draw your attention to India, which is towards the bottom of the diagram, where it's 1.7 CO2 emissions per capita, a low number, but we know that population is greatly expanding, and they want, quite understandably, the same type of quality of life that we have here in the United States, and even as China has been able to develop in recent years. So you can see on this graph, it shows you not only their annual emissions of CO2, or CO2 equivalent to be more precise, as well as the per capita emissions as an individual. What are we doing as we live our daily lives? So this is what's going on in the world today. And you can think of it, if you just look at the right side of this diagram, as those countries which cause the climate change, okay, that we're experiencing. And here, again, I would really say global warming if I had drawn this graph or map. And then the countries on the bottom that are actually going to suffer from the climate change that we're experiencing. And there's an imbalance. You can see the United States and Russia and China being ones that have had large contributions to climate change, and at the same time, the continent of Africa, for example, is suffering from what the developed countries have done. And so it's quite clear, and you've probably heard discussions about losses and damages, that the underdeveloped countries, or developing countries to be more PC, would like to have those developed countries that have caused the climate change problem that the developing countries are experiencing put forward at least technology that could be used in those countries, so that they would also provide funding to those other countries because they wish to improve their quality of life, while at the same time, they don't want to make the mistakes that the developed countries did to deplete our ozone layer and other environmental impacts that have occurred. The IPCC stands for the Intergovernmental Policy on Climate Change. This is an international group of scientists. In fact, I think for one of their earlier reports, they received the Nobel Peace Prize. We do have US participants who are part of the IPCC. And they've, at this point, finished their 7th report. It's the last one, came out in 2022. And it basically says it's now or never if we want to address climate change, that it's going to require a fundamental overhaul of nearly all aspects of human health, how we produce electricity, how we transport our power, how we transport ourselves in our cars, how we build cities, etc. Half of the Earth's emissions come from the consumption by the richest 10% of people. And we need to understand that climate change goes hand in hand with tackling other social issues. We want to bring the rest of the world to have a high quality of life and social services that we have in the developed countries, but we want to do it in a way that is going to be net zero, if you will, for global emissions. We don't want to do this in ways that will exacerbate the global warming problem more than it already is. So normally when I teach this, I do it over 6 hours. So I apologize trying to do this in about 35 minutes or so for you. And the students, after the beginning of the lectures, are in despair and depression. And I try and give them some measure of hope. And so I want to do the same with you as well. So here are some positive things that I'm aware of going on related to climate change and global warming. First of all, the cleanest form of energy that I know is energy conservation. And because of that, you can look to the GSA, General Services Administration, who's put out new standards on, for federal contractors, they have to use climate-friendly concrete and asphalt. Now that sounds like, boy, that's a small sector perhaps, but concrete production across the world accounts for 8% of global emissions. And so dealing with concrete in an energy efficient way is extremely important, and GSA has put out standards so the new federal buildings will meet those standards for low CO2 emitting concrete production. At the same time, roads cover 40% of the American cities, and they absorb and emit heat. And so GSA is requiring that its contractors use things such as bio-based binders and recycled materials in the asphalt, or even a glaze that reflects sunlight to therefore not absorb that and create additional heating. An exciting thing happened in May this year. The world's largest carbon capture plant was switched on. This was in Iceland, if you will, and it's dubbed the Mammoth, and it's designed to remove 36,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide, which is a very small amount when you look at the global situation. It pulls air through a series of filters to catch the CO2 molecules. Mind you, when you do that, you've got to put forward at least 250 times more air through, because CO2 is at 400 parts per million in our air. So a lot of air has to pass over these fans. The CO2 is mixed with water, and then it's pumped deep underground where it reacts with basalt and turns into stone. And it all runs on geothermal energy, which I will come back to in a minute as well. So we are at least beginning at scale to have carbon capture. And the Department of Energy, in fact, has a $3.5 billion program devoted to direct air capture. And it follows the same process you saw before. And each of the hubs that they are creating, and they're having 4, will be able to do at least 1 million metric tons, remembering that the Mammoth was 36,000 metric tons of CO2. This is getting closer to what we really need to do. If you look on the left side of this diagram towards the bottom, you'll see that they're collecting the CO2 in canisters. Now, that's one thing to go ahead and burn the fossil fuel and create CO2, capture it out of the air, but then what are you going to do with all of that CO2? Some people recommend that we go ahead and put it into the ground, and that there are deep caverns from which it won't escape. But there are other things that possibly that CO2 could be used for. Here's an example from a British startup that has designed a new plasterboard. It's made from agricultural waste that absorbs carbon dioxide, and it eliminates the need for gypsum. So the CO2 is trapped from smokestacks, passed over a mixture of agricultural waste and lime, and it forms calcium carbonate, which gives the plasterboard material mechanical strength as it solidifies. So here we are using CO2 and putting it into a form that replaces gypsum, which itself is a CO2 emitting material that certainly makes up all the drywall that we typically use in the United States. For the first time, rich countries now get half their electricity from zero carbon energy. That's worth noting that we're talking about the rich countries, the developed countries, and there we do see now half of the electricity from zero carbon. We know that in the first bullet you can see the emissions of planet heating gases hit a record high last year. Not a good thing, but over the same period, the rich economies, such as the United States, cumulatively responsible for much of the carbon in the atmosphere, saw their emissions drop. And in this case, it's driven largely by the transition away from fossil fuel power. So while economically and from a pollution perspective, it made sense for the United States before to at least move away from coal and to burn natural gas instead, now we're actually seeing the renewable energies beginning to take up a large fraction of our power generation. In fact, wind and solar, 34% of the power generation, and nuclear power making up the rest to a tune of about 50%. And the good news in this as well is the emissions fell, as you would expect, as we do more renewable energy, but also the overall gross domestic product of the world advanced by 2%. So you can use renewable energy and indeed still see your productivity go up. Now, one of the problems we have with renewable energy sources is we can collect that energy where the wind blows, where the sun shines, but that isn't necessarily where we need to use the energy. And so we have to transmit it from one place to another. You saw that there were dollars in the Inflation Reduction Act for advanced distribution systems. And you also saw in the Project 2025 that they were going to make it more difficult to have distribution systems, which would work against the ability to use renewable energy and promote more fossil fuel combustion. So there are ways to take our existing power lines and use state-of-the-art materials to double the capacity of the electric grid in our country. And this is advanced reconductoring, if you will. Lighter cores such as carbon fiber that can hold more aluminum, and thus it makes it much easier to move the solar and wind energy from the places that have a lot of sun, the places that have a lot of wind, to the places that need the energy because the local grids are too clogged to otherwise accommodate them. Another exciting piece of research, I believe, is the researchers at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory are harnessing a new source of clean energy, and it's actually the carbon dioxide. Now, the renewable natural gas removes CO2 from the atmosphere. We talked about direct capture, processes it using energy from solar and wind power, so it's processing it using renewable energy, and exposes it to a microorganism that turns it into methane that can be burned. Now, you might say, well, burning methane is another CO2 source, and we should perhaps minimize that. But on the other hand, you are at least keeping it zero because you're using the CO2 that's already being emitted. The good news about RNG, if you will, renewable natural gas, is it can be transported and stored in pipelines and underground reservoirs that we already have. In other words, if you don't want to improve the electric transmission systems that we have in our country, you can actually use the same pipelines that we have in our country that are delivering natural gas, but we're now going to be using a renewable natural gas instead of gas that we get through oil and gas exploration. And now I promised I'd come back to geothermal energy. Actually, we learned from our activities in hydrofracking, if you will, hydraulic fracturing, which enabled us now to, for the first time, drill very deep underground and actually to drill horizontally underground as well, directional drilling. We can use that technique to drill even further than where the oil and gas layers are to the hot water, which is actually close to the Earth's super hot rock, if you will. So, excuse me, this knowledge of the hydraulic fracturing is actually enabling us to think that geothermal can be more of a possibility. And then look in the last bullet here, just 1% of the Earth's super hot rock, 400 degrees C, could meet the global energy demand nearly 80 times over. So geothermal energy, and there's dollars, as you can see in the first bullet, from the Biden administration to set up pilot projects to develop this more, is another energy source where we're using just hot water and the Earth's core as opposed to burning fossil fuels. Now that's the large view, if you will, but the idea is to think globally and act locally. So here's what's going on, in fact, my own state. To start with, Maryland is completing its transition away from coal-fired power plants. We are scaling up the renewable infrastructure that we have. We are promoting electric vehicles. I have one, and I really enjoy driving it. It has great pickup. It allows me to go into the HOV lanes until other people think that that's a desirable quality they would like to have. In Montgomery County, now the county that I live in, has established new performance energy standards. They've educated the farmers on no-till practices, which would be ways not to reduce the CO2 associated with plowing the fields. And we have funding for solar community projects. And my wife and I participate in this as well. In Denver, Colorado, they have implemented strategies and investments to decarbonize the electric grid. They're subsidizing community solar programs. They created, in fact, a climate equity score to determine which neighborhoods have the most need for this form of energy. And one of my favorites is the little town of Carmel, Indiana, population of 102,000, which has 140 roundabouts, the highest anywhere in the nation. And it shows that these roundabouts ease congestion, they reduce tailpipe emissions, and they even prevent traffic accidents. So things can be done at the local level, not just the national level and not just the global level. What can you do, okay, as a person, individually? Well, you can bike more if you're able to and drive less. Consider how you may be able to minimize the number of trips you take. We certainly need to educate ourselves and our children as to how they could conserve natural resources, volunteer to clean up in the community, get involved in protecting your watershed, the water pollution associated with just daily life, reduce, reuse, recycle materials, conserve water. Water and its cleanup is very definitely tied to global warming issues. Choose sustainable foods, seafood, as opposed to beef products, if you will. Shop wisely. Bring a reusable shopping bag, a very easy, obvious thing to do. Better ways to do lighting. The original figure when Noah put this out had a compact fluorescent bulb there. I replaced it with a LED bulb, okay, which lasts longer and uses much less energy. Planting a tree is always a good idea. Don't send chemicals into our waterways because, again, that only taxes the water treatment centers and, in fact, can pollute our waters and streams. And these are ideas that NOAA just puts out for something you as an individual can do. Coming down the home stretch. So you've probably all heard of the Conference of Parties, the COP, the 28th time it met in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. You can see the period. And these were the recommendations that the COP28 came up with for the whole world to consider and take action on. To triple renewable energy capacity globally and doubling the global average annual rate of energy efficiency. Accelerate the phase down of unabated coal power. Unabated, a fancy word saying that you're not even trying to capture the CO2 from the coal power emissions. Accelerating efforts globally towards net zero emission energy systems, transitioning away from fossil fuels, and accelerating and substantially reducing non-CO2 emissions. The figure in the lower left is actually a screenshot from a program. I advise you, if you have the interest and time, to go ahead and look at. En-ROADS is its name. You can see that at the end of the link. And it allows you to trade off different policies on climate change. And you can say how much you want to allow coal to be burned, how much you may want to push renewable tax credits. You can do all of the policy decisions and choices to see how low you can actually get the global warming to be. The figure here shows +2 degrees centigrade is the goal. At one point, we were hoping to be a 1.5 degrees centigrade. And if you look at all the different options and their impact, and they interact with one another, so they're not individually being done, you can see if you were, quote unquote, in charge of the world and could establish different policies, what the impact would actually be on climate change. So a very interesting model that I work with my students on, and they get to move the levers, if you will, to see how far they can get to achieving a reduced global warming impact. So my next to last slide, I believe, is just to tell you this is what's actually happening in our world. That life on Earth hinges on a delicate balance. That balance is how much energy comes in from the sun and how much energy leaves and is reflected out to space from the planet. But we have tilted, if you will, that balance. And greenhouse gases mean that for the energy that is coming in, less is getting radiated back to space. NASA and NOAA research published, this is in 2021, shows that this imbalance has doubled between the years 2005 and 2019, and the magnitude of the increase is unprecedented. So we are fooling around, if you will, with our global warming problem. We are impacting our climate change in the most obvious and fundamental way. But just the way heat is transferred to our planet and from our planet is being impacted by our activities. So with that, I wanted to leave plenty of time for discussion and questions. I appreciate your attention and I look forward to your questions.
Because of the special process we have to go through to zoom in and zoom out, we only have one mic today. So I'm going to hand it off to you. I'm going to hand the mic off to people who would come up to the mic stand. As you're doing that, let me tell you also that this program, like all our programs, we've asked Professor Teichman if we could tape his talk and put it into our website. So you can, if you want to see these things again, just go to our website in about 3 weeks. And that website is www.chautauquascience.com, and copies of this, which give you all that, are in the back. Also, I'd like to put in a plug for the Climate and Lake Partnership that Mark Wensler is so involved in, and that website is www.chq.org. And then, is anything behind that? That's where they can start to find it about the climate change, about the Lake Initiative. Okay, climate.chq. Okay, so those are some things that if you want to further information, we advise you to go into. So let's start with asking questions. Please ask a question. Pardon me? Oh, if you're in the chat group, you can send in through the chat your questions. Okay, and Larry Rizzola will capture those and come up a little later. Okay, please ask your question.
Sorry? Okay. There's a substantial portion of one political party that thinks this is all a hoax. Do you have a standard elevator speech that tries to convince those people otherwise?
I get asked that question, excuse me, all the time. The best thing I can do is tell you my understanding of the science, which is what I've tried to do this morning. I think it makes a compelling case that climate change is really happening and is not a hoax. At the same time, I try and show you factually what each party is proposing to do to address this issue. And therefore, in my presentation, you saw what the current administration is doing and what the plan would be if an alternative administration was in place. So that's the best thing I can do, is just deal with the facts and make it clear to you the choice that's before you as you decide to vote on this and other issues.
Yes, I have a question having to do with nuclear energy. No one seems to be talking about that. I seem to recall that in France, they generate electricity with nuclear power. By like 80% of the electricity in France is generated by nuclear power. And I think the reason why they've been so successful is because they have a one design reactor pretty much, and they've been able to duplicate that around the country. So the question is, does nuclear have any role in helping improve our climate deterioration?
The answer to that question, in my opinion, is absolutely. Certainly, environmentalists do not like the fact that nuclear will create nuclear waste. And I think it is inappropriate for us to think from an environmental justice perspective that some small part of our nation should be the repository of all nuclear waste, while everybody else enjoys the benefits of nuclear power. But as we work towards nuclear fission, moving to nuclear fusion, there are ways that we can address that issue. It is an important area of research, and it's becoming, I think, once again, more important because of the situation with the burning of fossil fuels. That won't get us away from accidents such as Chernobyl or 3 Mile Island or Fukushima. So we need to look at this particular energy source in as clean and equitable fashion as possible, but I believe it is part of the solution.
My questions are more around the developing world, and two things I'd love to have you address are what are the concerns about the two largest rainforests in South America and the Congo Basin, and how there's selling of pieces of that for livelihoods in the developing world, and what's your thought on that? And my second one would be agriculture again, which is the livelihood of the majority of people in the developing world, and how does that affect climate change?
Those are both loaded and wonderful questions. Thank you very much. I hope I remember all the aspects to it. In terms of the rainforest, I find it hypocritical that we have recommendations to plant 1 trillion trees as the way to deal with the climate change problem, while at the same time we are cutting down the Amazon forest in parts of Africa. Also, there are people who believe that wood should be considered a renewable energy source. And I have a lot of problem when you cut down old growth trees and you go ahead and plant a new tree and say, well, this new tree is replacing the old tree. And of course, therefore, I haven't done anything to the environment. So I do believe that we need to be very careful of our forests. We need to plant more trees. And I think cutting down trees in the Amazon forest and elsewhere is not a direction to go. On the other hand, I do appreciate that for some people, this is their livelihood. And I think we need to find alternative ways to meet their livelihood than allowing them to draw their profits from the destruction of the forest. I'm a big fan, for example, of training people in Appalachia to move away from being coal miners and working towards renewable sources of energy. They need to be trained. They need to be given good jobs in that respect. That's why the current administration has made it clear it wants to give a lot of attention to those communities in need and build these new developing energy systems and industries in those areas to restore them to the vitality the rest of the country enjoys, while we've taken away their source of income, such as coal mining itself. Also, I think we in the United States, as I tried to mention before, need to understand that we have played a major role in what's going on in global warming. We aren't the only people who have, but nonetheless, there should be a responsibility to developing nations to share technology with them, to perhaps share some of the resources that we have in a fashion that they're able to have a higher quality of life than they currently do. One example, and I didn't even bring it up in my presentation, is the use of clean stoves in the developing world, that typically women primarily have had to search for wood to burn in those stoves. They've been subject to their own bodily harm while they're doing that, and they are burning in a way that is emitting important pollutants, not only to the outdoors, but in the indoors, where they may be, in fact, taking care of their children. We worked on clean stoves using appropriate fuel, little wood pellets that are much more efficient, that aren't burning cow dung, if you will, as a way of improving the quality of life, the quality of cooking in a way that really impacts women in particular across the globe. So I'm proud to be part of that effort. And I think we need to continue to look at ways to improve the quality of life elsewhere, because it will improve the quality of our lives as well.
Thank you for your presentation. I was wondering if you could dig deeper, a little pun intended, on the geothermal and using the fracking technology. We know that there's consequences to communities, with that technology. So how is the geothermal process would it create the similar problems, or is it a slightly different technology such that it would avoid some of those problems? And then just on the slide that showed the things that we could do about circular economy, is that something the government actually can be addressing? Something that's really needed in terms of reuse of textiles and all kinds of things. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. First of all, on hydraulic fracturing, I have studied hydraulic fracturing quite extensively, and there are certainly problems associated with the fluids that you put down into the ground and what comes back up out of the ground. And you can extract, if you want, the oil and gas from it, but nonetheless, you're then going to burn a fossil fuel. But what we've learned from hydraulic fracturing is the ability to drill deeper and to drill horizontally as well. So it's one well, if you will, and we can use multiple spokes from it. If we drill deep enough and use water to go into the earth and therefore heat up that water, bring it to the surface, use it for energy, then cool it and put it back down, we are dealing with a lot fewer chemicals, and we're not bringing out a fossil fuel to burn. And so therefore, I think geothermal does have a legitimate purpose, which should have fewer environmental impacts than hydraulic fracturing does. We're not using chemicals to get the fluid down. We are learning from hydraulic fracturing how to properly build those wells so they don't crack and therefore somehow contaminate aquifers. We have learned enough, I think, that we can begin to go deeper and just use water as the medium. That should help. In terms of the circular economy, my sense is the administration just recently came out with a single-use plastic policy that they're going to try and implement. And again, they'll do it first in the federal sector to demonstrate it can be done economically. And single-use plastic is one way, I think, to deal with a very difficult problem, because we know that plastic can disintegrate into small pieces, microplastics, and even nanoplastics. They get into the ocean, and they are things that we've seen fish mistake for food, for example. So yes, there are things that the federal government can do. I think one good step just recently is the single-use plastic policy that the president has proposed.
I live in an area of Northern Virginia known as Data Center Alley. It
Yes.
has the largest collection of data centers in the world, and the data centers have a tremendous need for power. Are
Yes.
there any solutions for where you have highly concentrated areas that need a lot of power?
Well, the first thing is those data centers, you're absolutely right, are a very large demand on energy. And we have to figure out ways to accomplish that task in much more efficient ways. One of the points on my slide I didn't stress is quantum computing, which is a new way of doing computational work faster that should hopefully have a smaller energy footprint than what the current data mining systems have. The other thing I could say is if we do indeed meet that need in a less energy demanding way, then even as they may demand more energy than we want, we have to have the distribution systems in place to get from where the energy is being generated, particularly from renewable sources, to energy intensive areas such as that. That's about the best I can offer you, but I think quantum computing is an important part of the solution.
Thank you for your life's work. Very important. Yesterday, at 2 o'clock, we heard Dr. George McLean, and he talked about the civil rights movement and how that changed the world as we knew it, especially I grew up in the American South. I know that civil disobedience has been used to some degree in the environmental movement, the Keystone Pipeline, for example. Are there other ways to use civil disobedience effectively on a going forward basis? And I ask that as a Presbyterian children's Sunday school teacher. So.
Well, first of all, thank you for your work. I think dealing with the next generation is the reason that I do the work that I do. And I do the work that I do because I have children and I have, thank God, grandchildren, and I want to leave the world better for my having been here when they experience it and carry on afterwards. I would turn to Cancer Alley as an example for you. Cancer Alley is an area of Louisiana that has connections to the Mississippi River. It has the highest percentage of petrochemical plastic generating plants anywhere. If you look at who is exposed to the emissions from those plants, you see very definitely disproportionately people of color or people of low socioeconomic status. And those people have come up and raised issues about them receiving a disproportionate risk. They are at twice the risk of getting cancer of any other place, okay, in the United States. And so they have shown some civil disobedience. They have demonstrated, and they've been able to actually get some new plants not being built in their area because of this. We need to do more to reduce the risk of the existing plants, but at least their civil disobedience to inhibit the establishment of new power plants or new chemical plants has been a success story, in my opinion. Environmental justice started with the issue of waste in cities. And so there has been a greater attention, particularly, I believe, in this administration, to looking at those disadvantaged communities and doing what we can to help them. 40% of the resources in the Inflation Reduction Act, as I understand it, are supposed to be devoted to disadvantaged communities. Is it because they practice civil disobedience? I don't know, but it's because their voices are being heard in whatever mechanism, through their representatives, through demonstrations, whatever, and we are devoting a disproportionate amount of resources to those areas because they have been experiencing disproportionately high risk that other areas haven't.
We're going to stay here as long as people have questions, but I want to ask Mark Wenzler to come up and make an announcement before any people start to leave.
Thanks, Bob. And this will be quick, and it's more some other programs happening that relate to, I think, a lot of interest I'm hearing today let's see, the circular economy. We're actually having a forum on the circular economy on August 7th. So anybody here or coming back August 7th, please talk to me or my friend Brad Max over here, who's helping organize this. Secondly, we have a program this afternoon at 12:15 at Smith Wilkes Hall. Maya Van Rossum, the founder of Green Amendments for the Generations, will talk about one of the things we can do about climate change is pass constitutional amendments in states for the right to a clean environment. And then thirdly, on the civil disobedience question, I know that that's certainly a personal choice, but we do have Bill McKibben here this week. And his group, Third Act, will be doing some information sessions, including at the United Methodist House on Thursday at 3:30. And I do know, being a Third Act member myself, that civil disobedience is one of the tools that they use, but certainly it's not required to be a member. So anyway, I just wanted to make folks aware of those three things, and love the questions you're all generating and want to get back to those.
Hi, I'm wondering what is being done, or if anybody researches patents that have been suppressed that would help people. An example is in the early 70s, my parents were part of a group that saw a demonstration of what was called the coal system, invented by a father-son engineering group, that would use like a 50-gallon to 500-gallon tank of water, and it would use the urine or the uric acid and the byproducts of the toilet to start a hydraulic process that purified the human waste, make it pure enough to use as organic matter, and then they would reuse that constantly. They didn't have the means to produce it, so they sold it to American Standard, where it was never heard from again. And I thought, wow, wouldn't this have been great in the Southwest and parts of California and other places where water is a terrible problem. And I'm just wondering if there's any research done on patents that could be viable but that are being suppressed.
I'm not the best one to answer that, but let me try and take a stab in multiple ways. First of all, an important policy that was put forward in the last administration was a transparency in science rulemaking, in which case the data that was underlying regulations should be made publicly available. Now that was on the surface a very good thing, but what it was intentionally doing was saying that epidemiologic studies on health effects that people are experiencing from particulate matter, ozone, whatever, would not be available to inform regulations on those pollutants because they were epidemiologic, and you needed to have the health information of people, you needed to know where they were working, you needed to know where they lived. And so that was an attempt, as far as I'm concerned, to suppress data that could inform environmental protection regulation or even just policies. So I think that's one example that I was personally involved in. In terms of products, I'm not aware of some product being bought out by a larger group that doesn't want to see that product come to market. But that could just be the part of the elephant that I work in. The last thing I want to say is that this is all very important in the climate change perspective. There are a group of scientists in the federal government who do an assessment of the United States situation on climate change. And there was a report that people have heard in the past. This was tempered, if you will, by the politicals above. And that, I think, is a potential issue, that the scientists' view of things is not being shared, okay? However, in the Trump administration, we did get that report out. And I think the administration felt that their only response was, that's a research paper, it's not a policy paper. They assumed all the worst possible scenarios, etc. But we in the federal government, as the scientists, are trying to share everything we know. And I think activities now in terms of scientific integrity are enabling us to do so in ways that, in fact, I apologize if this sounds self-serving, but I wrote the scientific integrity policy for EPA, and it makes it clear that our scientists can say what they believe the science is, and a political cannot interfere and reverse the publications that the scientists write. So that's the world that I live in the scientific research. I apologize if I didn't answer your question well with individual products. That's probably the Federal Trade Commission that might make sure that products see the light of day and aren't buried because of larger companies' interests.
In many of the discussions about climate change here, there's been very little mention about the increasing temperatures on the Earth. What are your thoughts on geoengineering the upper atmosphere with aerosols to block sunlight from the Earth and cooling the planet?
Yes, thank you. An excellent question. First of all, I prefer conservation. As I said before, that is the cleanest form of energy that I know. Geoengineering is being looked at. I don't really like the concept of putting particles in the air, which is it's using one pollutant to try and mask another pollutant, if you will. We don't know how much particles to put in to accomplish the desired effect. We don't know if we overshoot or undershoot, or is this something we constantly have to continue to do in the geoengineering aspect? So I'm not a big fan of tampering with our atmosphere. Some geoengineering systems I've seen deal with putting up things in outer space that have an impact on decreasing or increasing one way or the other, depending on what you're trying to accomplish. And at least they don't seem to be polluting our atmosphere with these potential approaches. Very much, it's scary to me, frankly. I don't want to use one pollutant to mask another. That's just a basic principle, it seems to me. The other is, are we going to see unintended consequences that we don't even know about now? And the best thing we can do is deal with the problem by reducing emissions and taking renewable energy sources so that we don't have to use geoengineering. But it is an area of research that I'm aware of, and there are certain aspects that have some promise and some that are very troubling to me.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. Also, I'm so glad someone asked about geoengineering. That was going to be my second question, so got that out of the way. I work for the DOE office that does the demonstration project, so thank you for the shout out. I got a little nervous when you were talking about how they're going to get rid of the renewable energy work that DOE is doing. We've all said that we think our office is going to be fine because it's funded through the bipartisan infrastructure law, so it's bipartisan, we should be okay. But I think as I got into working for the government, I realized I really don't understand how the government works. So selfishly, I would love if you could explain a little bit, like procedurally, how the Trump administration could do things like get rid of renewable energy work at DOE or prevent the spread of California's emission standards. Is it through, executive order, through the courts? Yeah, how would that work actually?
All right. Excuse me, that's a whole lecture in itself. First of all, thank you for your efforts. Believe it or not, I used to work at DOE before I worked at EPA. I worked on indoor air quality because as we were tightening buildings for energy conservation purposes, we were actually trapping indoor pollutants. And EPA wasn't really interested in indoor air quality in the beginning. So finally, there was legislation passed in 1986 that said that EPA could go ahead and put out technical information and do research on indoor air. And I was asked by the EPA folks to come over and lead their research program that later led to being involved in more than just indoor air quality. So at that time, it was conservation and renewable energy that we called it. It was CE. The administration that came in at the time and our assistant secretary said energy conservation ought to be things that the industry does and people do on their own if there really is an economic benefit to be had. So they would zero out our budget request when it would go over to Congress, and Congress would put it always back in, saying that we need to stimulate conservation and renewable energy. How our government works in policymaking, as you know, is that the president proposes a budget and the Washington lingo is that the Congress disposes the budget that is put forward by the president and puts out what it thinks is right. So I would expect if the Trump administration, a future Trump administration comes in and they're consistent with the report, Project 2025, they will put in a budget request that will severely reduce the funding to the Office of what is now renewable, and I forget the energy efficiency, excuse me, I believe its new title, because conservation was felt by some administrations to mean Americans had to give up things and they didn't want to have that in the name. So that's probably going to happen, and then the budget will be decided by Congress. So who is in Congress, particularly on the Appropriations Committee, will dictate what the budgets are for those offices. In terms of the policies that come out, they can be debated all the way up to the Supreme Court. I'm not aware of any yet, but the appliance standards that come out of the Department of Energy are something that the president, the former president, has said he wants to relax. So you'd see more incandescent bulbs and less LED bulbs, which I think is moving in the wrong direction from an energy perspective. And they can put forward those policies. They can be undone by a Congress that disagrees with it under the Congressional Review Act, or they can be litigated in the courts. And that's how our nation works. To the extent that when litigation at its highest level goes to the Supreme Court, it's important to know their particular views on things such as climate change. One thing, for example, that I know of in the Project 2025 report, they are saying that the EPA ought to re-review the endangerment decision by which EPA had authority to control CO2, and that went all the way up to the Supreme Court. So sometimes policies get debated at the very highest levels. I hope that answers your question.
Hi, I just wanted to follow up on the nuclear energy question and get your viewpoint on some of the newer fission reactor designs that are available in like the reactor in Wyoming, and in terms of the viability and the safety of those designs.
I think they're an improvement over what we had before. And I believe it is part of the solution, as I stated earlier. This is not to say that I don't worry about nuclear waste from fission, because that is a potential concern. And I believe it ought to be equitably distributed. For example, maybe each state should have a nuclear repository, just so that it is, as I say, equitable in the treatment of the potential risk from nuclear. On the other hand, I'm optimistic, particularly in the future, in fusion, if we can get there, and fission is still better, in my opinion, than burning coal and seeing not only the CO2 emissions, but also the impact on public health.
Thank you.
My question is on carbon credits. A few months ago, the Biden administration put some guidelines into the buying and selling of carbon credits. And I just wondered, what are your feelings about intermediaries that buy carbon credits from industries that produce a lot of carbon and then invest it in areas that can help mitigate some of the carbon issues?
If I'm understanding your question correctly, and I apologize if I'm not, carbon credits, if they indeed are offsetting pollution from carbon dioxide and putting it in less, closer to net zero, maybe even negative zero carbon emission technologies, I'm okay with that. But I'm aware of carbon taxes and cap and trade policies. I'm aware of the price of carbon that is being increased. And I think either a tax which works well on industries to balance what their real costs are, I think is something you may see in the future as well. Right now, I can tell you that the Obama administration had a carbon value of $50 per ton. The Trump administration reduced it during its time down to $1 and at its highest $8 per ton. And now the Biden administration has put it back up at about $53 per ton. And economists are telling me it really ought to be at about $100 per ton. So that's the view I have. Anything that promotes less carbon emissions and more renewable sources of energy, I'm all in favor of. I hope that answers it. I'm not a great economist. I apologize.
Thank you, sir. I'm a registered environmental manager, and
could you speak up? Don't take your mask off, but speak up.
I'm a registered environmental manager, and I was looking into. I'm from Colorado, and we have in Golden, Colorado, we have, I think, almost every household owns a pet, some kind of dog or cat or something along those lines. And I was wondering if the EPA is looking into the food stock for these animals. I think the footprint for the entire animal husbandry industry, including livestock, is a pretty high percentage of our total carbon output. And I don't exactly remember the numbers. I think 15% or something like that. And almost half of that is from pets, you know. And could they adjust the food source for these animals, get them away from the meats, because that's what's causing the carbon footprint, you know, the drain on the meat supply. Most of the livestock production is for feeding the pets. And I understand that one large dog can put out as much carbon as a large SUV per year. So any thoughts on that?
I'm not aware of any research at EPA going on related to cats and dogs and their potential emissions and footprints. I would say more research is going on cattle and the burps that they create. There are filters now that people put over the nose of cattle. They certainly do change their feed. And I think when things are demonstrated to have the impact on cattle and beef production in that fashion, hopefully it will trickle down to cats and dogs. So I'm not aware, to answer your question, of any research at EPA. There may well be research at USDA, the Department of Agriculture, but we weren't doing that at EPA. We were, however, looking at the enteric emissions from beef production and what we could do with that.
Thank you, Kevin. I know you can't see me, but we can still see you. I want to thank all of you for being here. Next week, we're going to be having, it sounds kind of esoteric, on the creation of a new metric system. But let me guarantee, I can guarantee you that establishing international standards is a key part of our controlling all of these environmental issues. And it will be live here, not Zoomed. So if you prefer that, I can guarantee that. One of the things that the science group wants you all to be is careful consumers of scientific information. And I find that even the best places like the New York Times and the Washington Post will have articles summarizing recent studies and saying, well, the numbers show this and show that. And then 3 months later, there's one showing no other numbers show other things. You just need to be careful. But one of the sets of numbers I'm trying to be careful about, there are people who say they're scientists, who say that there's a 60% chance that all this climate change and global warming is just part of the natural rhythms of life. And, you know, let's assume they were right. And that means there's a 40% chance that what we're doing is causing potential disaster. Do we want to gamble on our children and grandchildren's life that, hey, there's a 60% chance if we keep doing this and keep doing that, nothing bad will happen and we'll be okay? I don't want to make that gamble. I want us to keep using science to try to figure out ways we can make life manageable and better. Thank you for coming. On your way out, there's a basket, and we appreciate very much contributions. They allow us to give a scholarship to a young student and keep science alive. Thank you very much.
Let me make one last comment, if I may. Thank you for your attention. People ask me, what can they do to save the planet? I'm not worried about the planet. The planet's going to be here. It's life as we know it on the planet now that I'm worried about. And that's why we're doing what we're doing. And I'm going to sign off, I guess.
Hey, thank you, Kevin. Really appreciate it.
Sure.
Great job.
Thanks.